In a sterile laboratory, under the cold glow of overhead light, a single human tooth sits beneath a microscope. It doesn't look like much, a small, unremarkable fragment of a life. But this tooth is about to do something no piece of ancient Egyptian evidence has ever done before. It's about to speak. Its owner has been dead for more than 4,500 years. He lived and died in the age of the first pyramids, buried not in a golden sarcophagus, but sealed inside a simple clay pot, tucked into a tomb carved directly into a hillside south of Cairo. For over a century, his remains sat quietly in a museum collection, one skeleton among thousands, his identity a total blank. Then scientists cracked open his DNA, and what they found didn't just tell them who he was. It forced historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about ancient Egypt itself. Here's the strange part. Everything about his body says he spent his life doing hard, repetitive physical labor. But everything about the way he was buried says he was someone of status, a worker's body, an elite's grave. Those two facts should not belong to the same person. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why solving that contradiction has scientists genuinely divided. Let's go back to where it began. It was 1902, and Egypt was in the middle of its most intense era of foreign-led excavation. Under British colonial administration, an archaeological committee organized by John Garstang was digging through a site near the village of Nuweirat, roughly 260 kilometers south of Cairo. Rock-cut tombs lined the hillside, holding the dead of a civilization already ancient by the time these excavators arrived. Inside one of them, they found something unusual, a body, not laid out in a wooden coffin, but folded into a large ceramic vessel and sealed inside a tomb cut straight into the rock. At the time, nobody could have known what that body would eventually reveal. It was catalogued, studied for its bones, and eventually shipped across the Mediterranean to the World Museum in Liverpool, England, where it joined a vast collection of Egyptian antiquities. It sat through decades of quiet storage. It survived the Second World War, including the bombing raids of the Blitz that devastated so much of Liverpool. It survived changing fashions in archaeology, shifting theories about ancient Egypt, and the slow turnover of generations of researchers who walked past it without asking the one question that mattered most. What was inside this man's cells? To understand why that question took over a century to answer, you have to understand just how badly ancient Egypt has resisted giving up its genetic secrets. Egypt is hot. Egypt is dry in some places and humid in others, but almost everywhere it is punishingly warm. And heat is the enemy of DNA. Genetic material is fragile. It breaks down steadily over time, and high temperatures accelerate that breakdown dramatically compared to the cooler, more stable conditions found in places like Northern Europe, where ancient DNA has been recovered from remains tens of thousands of years old. In Egypt, by comparison, even samples a fraction of that age have often been unusable. The first real attempt to beat this problem came in 1985, when a young researcher named Svante Pääbo, who would later win a Nobel Prize for his pioneering work in ancient genetics, managed to extract partial DNA from Egyptian mummy tissue. It was a landmark moment, proof that Egyptian remains weren't a complete scientific dead end, but it was also just a fragment, a whisper, not a voice. Progress crept forward from there. In 2017, a team led by geneticist Johannes Kraus at the Max Planck Institute achieved something remarkable. They analyzed DNA from 151 mummy heads, spanning over 1,000 years of Egyptian history. It was the largest genetic survey of ancient Egyptians ever conducted, and it delivered a genuine surprise. Modern Egyptians, the study found, share significantly more DNA with sub-Saharan African populations than these ancient individuals did. For years, many had assumed that foreign invasions and conquests over the centuries had pushed Egypt's genetic makeup to become more connected to Europe and the Near East over time. This study found almost the opposite pattern. It suggested that Egypt's deeper African genetic ties actually increased in more recent history, likely tied to increased trade, migration along the Nile, and other later population movements. It was already forcing a rethink. But even that landmark study had a limitation. Out of 151 mummies, only 3 yielded anything close to a complete genome. The rest offered only partial fragments, mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through the maternal line, a narrow sliver of a much bigger genetic story. Egypt still had not given up a single full, whole genome sequence from its ancient past. That changed in 2025. Researchers from the Francis Crick Institute in London, working alongside archaeologists from Liverpool John Moores University, returned to that century-old skeleton from Nuweirat, the one folded into a clay pot, sitting in storage since 1902. Using cutting-edge sequencing technology that didn't exist even a decade earlier, they extracted material from the root tip of one of his teeth. Specifically, they targeted a dental tissue called cementum, the substance that anchors a tooth into the jawbone. It turns out cementum is unusually good at locking DNA away and protecting it from the ravages of time and heat. 7 separate extracts were pulled from that single tooth. Only 2 of them were preserved well enough to sequence. Just 2 chances out of 7 to succeed after more than 4,000 years underground and another century in storage. They succeeded. For the first time in history, scientists had a complete, whole genome from an individual who lived in ancient Egypt during the Old Kingdom, the era of the very first pyramids. Geneticist Pontus Skoglund, who leads ancient DNA research at the Crick Institute, called it the culmination of decades of technical struggle, finally breaking through a wall that had defeated researchers since Pebo's first attempt 40 years earlier. So what did they find? The genome revealed that this man's ancestry was roughly 80% rooted in ancient North African populations, the expected result for someone from this region and era. But the remaining 20% traced back to an entirely different part of the world, the Fertile Crescent, the region historians associate with Mesopotamia, encompassing parts of what is now Iraq, Iran, and Jordan. This mattered enormously. Historians and archaeologists had long suspected that ancient Egypt maintained trade and cultural contact with Mesopotamian societies. The evidence was there in shared imagery, in similarities between early writing systems, in pottery styles that seemed to echo across the region. But suspecting contact and proving it are 2 very different things. Cultural exchange doesn't always mean people themselves were moving and mixing. This genome was the first direct, biological evidence that populations from Mesopotamia and Egypt weren't just trading goods and ideas. They were, at some point, having children together. Real people, crossing real distances, leaving a real genetic fingerprint that survived over 4,500 years. But the genetics were only half the story. The other half came from his bones. Bioarchaeologist Joel Irish and his colleagues studied the man's skeleton in painstaking detail, looking for the physical fingerprints of a life of labor. And they found them. His seat bones were enlarged, consistent with long hours spent sitting in one position. His arms showed clear signs of repetitive, extensive back-and-forth movement. And most tellingly, there was significant arthritis concentrated in just his right foot. Not both feet, just one. That kind of asymmetrical wear pattern isn't random. It points to a specific repeated motion. Irish and his team believe that motion may have come from operating a pottery wheel, a technology that, remarkably, arrived in Egypt around the exact time this man was alive. Pumping a foot pedal or spinning a wheel with one leg, over and over for years, could produce exactly this kind of wear. The theory took hold. This man, they proposed, may have spent his life as a potter, one of the earliest craftsmen in Egypt to work with this new wheel-based technology. It's a compelling picture. But here's where the story takes its sharpest turn. A potter, by the standards of the time, should not have received the kind of burial this man got. Being sealed in a large ceramic vessel, placed inside a rock-cut tomb, was a treatment associated with people of elevated status, not typical laborers. Irish himself has acknowledged the contradiction is real. It doesn't fit the expected pattern. So who was he really? Nobody knows for certain, and any documentary claiming otherwise would be lying to you. What researchers can offer are informed possibilities, not verdicts. Perhaps he was an exceptionally skilled craftsman, so talented that his work elevated his social standing beyond what his trade would normally allow. Perhaps he had a patron, someone powerful who valued his work enough to grant him an elite burial. Or perhaps ancient Egyptian society allowed more social mobility for skilled artisans than historians have generally assumed, and this man is simply the first hard evidence of it. To bring the picture even closer, researchers used three-dimensional scans of his skull, combined with detailed analysis of his facial bone structure, to reconstruct what he may have looked like in life. For the first time in over 4,500 years, this nameless man has a face again. His story doesn't end with this single discovery. Egypt has now launched an ambitious new initiative called the National Egyptian Genome Project, aiming to sequence DNA from 200 mummies alongside 100,000 living Egyptian citizens. The goal is to build a genetic map spanning the full arc of Egyptian history, from the age of the pyramids to the present day. This one tooth, from this one man, buried in this one clay pot, may end up being remembered as the opening chapter of a much larger genetic reckoning with Egypt's past. Somewhere between the labor etched into his bones and the status carved into his burial lies a life we will never fully recover. A craftsman, perhaps. A social climber, perhaps. A mystery, certainly. For over 4,000 years, he waited in silence. It took a single tooth, a century of storage, and 40 years of scientific struggle to finally let him speak. And what he told us didn't just describe his own life, it quietly rewrote what we thought we understood about the ancient world he lived in. Proof that history is never as finished as we assume, and that sometimes the smallest fragment of a person can still change everything we thought we knew. The scientists who conducted the study have been careful to acknowledge the limits of what a single genome and skeleton can prove. This is one person, one life, one snapshot from a civilization that spanned 3,000 years. It offers a glimpse, not a complete picture. Drawing sweeping conclusions about all ancient Egyptians from this one man would be a mistake, and the researchers themselves have said as much. But glimpses matter, especially first ones.